If you want to go green, you first need to be conscious. So welcome to Conscious Lifestyles with Ginger Leilani Chapin.
Hey there, welcome to Conscious Lifestyles radio show today. I am so pleased to have a very distinguished guest with me today, Benedict Beckeld. Quite a man you are. Everyone has to check out his absolutely beautiful website, Benedict, Benedict, Beckeld, Beckeld.com, BenedictBeckeld.com. We are talking today primarily about his volunteer work in the Kalahari Desert. Benedict, you speak 7 languages. You have studied all over the world. You were a professor in Europe. You did volunteer work in the Kalahari Desert. You wrote a memoir about it, which is one of several books you've written. So today we're going to talk about what inspired you to go work in the Kalahari Desert, leave a very fruitful life behind, I can imagine, with all the creature comforts and the accolades that you had deservedly earned, to go and work with children as a volunteer. So welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So tell us briefly about your background. You are extraordinarily interesting.
Well, I was born in Sweden, but I come from a rather multicultural family. There's a Brazilian and Jewish in addition to Swedish, but I was born and raised in Sweden. Then came to the United States with my immediate family as a teenager and went to high school and college here. But then I went back to Europe, not to Sweden though, but to the continent, mainly France and Germany, did all my graduate work there, got my master's and PhD. And in philosophy and classics, those were my subjects, and not directly related to the volunteer work I did later. But then after that, I think probably I had enough of academia, of the narcissism that often is a part of that, and felt that I wanted to do something a little bit for other people if possible. And so off I went.
Well, there is quite a bit of intellectual snobbery, I will say, in the academic world. I have experienced it myself. However, when you push through that and you see how there is a calling for educated people to roll up their sleeves and truly make this world a better place, it is a huge calling, and I thank you for listening to that call. So at what point did you say, I've got to go work in the Kalahari Desert?
Well, it wasn't specifically the Kalahari Desert, but I did want to go to an underprivileged community somewhere in the developing world. And that calling became stronger for me, I think, in the latter days of my years as a graduate student. And I think by the time I finished all my studies, that calling had grown so strong, essentially, because if you're working as a graduate student, you're essentially just working on yourself. You're working on your own advancement and gaining knowledge for yourself and to get the degrees for yourself so that you can have a job as a professor later on. And all of that essentially jaded me, I suppose, a bit, and I felt, so it was a very personal decision, though I imagine that's probably true for a lot of volunteers, but I felt that it would make me into a richer human being to be able to do something for others, if possible, and to help them. And so ultimately, in a way, of course, that was also for my sake, because when you go and volunteer, everybody knows that's going to be probably a very enriching experience for the volunteer also. But ultimately, I wanted to do something for others, and so that calling became stronger probably within the 2-3 years or so before I actually went, and so I started looking around for various organizations that send volunteers into the developing world, and once I did, I found I was essentially able to narrow it down to a couple of different places, and Namibia, the eastern Namibia, which is part of the Kalahari Desert, was one of those places, and once I applied, you choose a couple of places. That was one of the places I chose, and that's where I ended up being sent.
Well, I've never been to Namibia, but I have been to East Africa and different parts of Africa, which I truly love and I adore. I see a need there for conservation in such a huge way, not only conservation of people and their tribal rights, and their indigenous ways of living, and to stop the encroachment of the Western, I'd say, special interests, if I could say it that way, and also conservation of the natural world, the wildlife. That to me was something that just struck me, and I try on my show to make that a priority, to get people to think about how they can live a higher life. What can you do to make the world a better place, despite the fact that you're a very busy person? Because we're all busy. So you put everything down. You decided, I'm going to go do this. What were you teaching to these tribal children? It was the Herero tribe in eastern Namibia?
Yeah, the Herero tribe, which is used to be a much more powerful tribe than it is today. I was teaching English. That was my main job. And also a little bit of other things, HIV, AIDS awareness, because in Namibia, as in many other African countries, unfortunately, the rate of infection is extremely high, approaching 20%. And some, because of traditional ways, not all of them are aware that there is such a thing as retroviral drugs or things like that they can take. Sometimes they'll go to a witch doctor if they get HIV, and of course the witch doctor isn't able to do anything. So there was some emphasis on that as well, but mainly it was English. And the reason that they need to learn English, one might say, well, why can't they just speak their tribal language? And that's because, this is something you just touched upon when you said the encroachment of Western ways and so on. This encroachment nowadays, of course, in what is mainly the post-colonial period, that encroachment happens now mainly at the hands, it's being perpetrated, if you will, essentially by their own governments. So nowadays it's not so much directly Westerners doing it, though of course you could still find cases of that, but essentially the Namibian government itself that has become so westernized through colonial history and so on that now if you want to be anyone in Namibia, you have to speak English. And so even though colonization, we can say that colonization might have been better if it hadn't happened, since colonization happened, it is the case today that they have to know English or they will live very miserable lives. And so that was part of my job to help them learn that. English became the official language of Namibia after independence from South Africa in 1990. And they decided to try to overcome intra-tribal hostility by having everyone learn English instead of having a particular tribal language compete with other tribal languages.
They were colonized. They were colonized in the late 19th century. Is that correct?
Yes, by the Germans. Okay,
and you have talked about this. The Germans have a very dark history with the Herero tribe. There was genocide. Genocide. Tell us about that. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's correct. The genocide, which is arguably the first genocide of the 20th century, certainly not the last, of course, but that was started in 1904. The Germans had colonized what is today Namibia in the 1880s. But in 1904, the Herero tribe, which was the tribe I lived with, and also the Nama tribe, the neighboring tribe, they decided to launch a rebellion against colonial rule, and was certainly a very understandable idea, but unfortunately a hopeless one, since the Germans had far superior weaponry and so on. And so after the main battle, which was the Battle of Waterberg, it's called in northern Namibia in 1904, which was a German victory, the Germans decided not only to win the battle and put down the rebellion, but they decided to essentially set an example and discourage anyone in the future from having the idea of rebelling. And so they issued very explicitly the extermination command, Vernichtungsbefehl in German. And so there was a very deliberate attempt to kill essentially as many of the tribesmen as possible, men, women, and children indiscriminately. And they were quite successful in doing that. About 80% of the Herero tribe was wiped out.
Wow.
Which corresponds to, in those days, almost 100,000 people. The overall population of that tribe was about 120,000, 110,000 or so at that time. And so about 80% of all of those were killed. So the Herero tribe, when I said before, used to be a much more powerful tribe. They were much more spread out over Namibia and other parts of southern Africa, and now they're much more confined to eastern Namibia and to western Botswana, and as a direct result of the war, because they fled into the Kalahari Desert and died of thirst there. And when they tried to come back from the Kalahari Desert, German imperial troops patrolled the borders of the desert and fired upon any survivors that tried to make it back from the desert. And so that was essentially how they accomplished that.
Well, we do have to go to a very quick break. This is incredibly fascinating, and it's horrifying at the same time. We are talking with Dr. Benedict Beckeld today. You've got to check out his amazing website, Benedict Beckeld, BECKELD.com. This is Conscious Lifestyles. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Conscious Lifestyles Radio Show. This is Ginger Leilani Chapin. I'm talking with Dr. Benedict Beckeld today. Please check out his website, Benedict Beckeld, BECKELD.com. Very fascinating man you are. You have written several books, and your latest memoir, called Kalahari Singing, is a fascinating book on your volunteer work in the Kalahari Desert, working as a volunteer teacher in eastern Namibia for the Herero tribe. Before we had to go to a break, you were explaining to my audience and to me this horrific genocide that took place in the late 19th century by the Germans in Namibia to wipe out the tribal people, the Herero tribe. What was the purpose of doing that when they were trying to, quote unquote, colonize Namibia?
The colonization itself, which started, indeed, as you said, in the late 19th century, that was initially reasonably peaceful. As peaceful as such an endeavor can be, at least. And in the beginning, it went reasonably well, just a very fairly small group of German farmers who just lived and worked there. But then things in 1904, being the specific year, things took a turn for the worse when the tribesmen of the Herero and the Nama tribes tried to regain their independence. And so the reason for the genocide was essentially not only to beat the rebellion, but also to completely crush any national spirit, any national identity that could lead to a future rebellion. And so the Germans made very sure to wipe out as large numbers of the Herero and Nama tribes as possible.
You know, it appears as though any colonization, certainly with the American colonization in the United States, when the American Indians were also faced with genocide and horrific abuse and killing and warfare, in order to displace them as well as to weaken them and just annihilate them completely, exterminate them. It seems as though that level of behavior has been going on for way too many hundreds of years now, I'd say since the beginning of time, I think. However, this is an unknown warfare to many of us in the Western world. We don't really learn about what happened to Namibia, as I'm sure you're well aware. A lot of people don't know the genocide and the annihilation of the Herero tribe in order to bring fear and warfare to this country in order to control them and certainly rob them of their resources, because Namibia is very wealthy in resources, natural resources. So when you went to the Kalahari Desert in your memoir, Kalahari Singing, you went to teach these incredible children about English and teach them certainly maybe some Western culture. However, you found a lot of abuse going on within the system of the volunteer work that you were doing. Can you talk about that?
Sure. It was something that wasn't clear in the beginning, that became increasingly clear after I'd been there for maybe a month or so. Essentially, the fact that there was a severe amount of corporal punishment against the students in the school, directed from the other teachers who were also members of the same tribe. I was the only teacher there, the only Western teacher there, and of course it's fairly commonly known that in many parts of the developing world they'll have different ways of, or different ideas about how to how to rear children and so on. And going to another society, one must always keep in mind that our own way isn't always the best, and so be open-minded to other ways of doing things. So the discovery that a little bit of corporal punishment was taking place in the beginning wasn't that big of a deal, really. Slap on the wrist or so on, which would be unthinkable in schools here in the United States, certainly weren't so over there. But over time, I discovered that it was actually much, much worse than that. Students would be beaten, and not just spanked or slapped on the wrist, but literally beaten in the face, and sometimes even with fists, and not only for misbehaving, but even for things like not getting enough correct answers on exams. And so there was sort of the attitude on part of a lot of the teachers that intelligence could literally be beaten into a child's head, and that if we beat them sufficiently, then they'll do better on the next test. And that put me in a very difficult situation, not only, of course, because I think such disciplining methods are wrong, but also because the students themselves knew that I was the only teacher who would not lay my hand on them. And so they came to me seeking my protection, essentially, against the other teachers. So that put me in a very difficult spot. Of course, I agreed with the students, but in order to get something useful done in the community, it was also important for me not to alienate the entire community right at once. And so I tried to sort of mediate between those two sides, which became very difficult over time. I felt better about trying to reduce the levels of corporal punishment by the fact that it is illegal in Namibia. The federal government is very clear on the topic that any violence by teachers against students is completely illegal. But the law works often well in the capital city, in Windhoek, and other larger cities, but often does not reach out into the tribal communities where it's usually the tribal traditions that are in effect and not the federal law.
Well, let me ask you a question here. That was my next question. Is it the tribal people who are beating these children, or is it the volunteers from Western countries who are violently abusing these children?
Yeah, no, it's definitely the teachers themselves of that particular tribe. Western volunteers have been very clearly inculcated. It was even part of my volunteer contract to never touch a child, and that I would be immediately terminated if I ever did. And most volunteers, I think, who come there are the type of person who wouldn't do such a thing. Essentially, there's usually young idealists who believe in promoting peace and understanding between cultures. And so maybe there has been some isolated case of a volunteer raising a hand against a child. That's possible. But overall, it's most certainly not the volunteers, but rather the teachers, the indigenous teachers themselves who do that.
Well, you know what strikes me as so strange is that most indigenous children in developing countries don't have access to any schooling whatsoever, and it's really a privilege. It should be a right to have an education, but it becomes a privilege. The fact that these children are seeking out, education should be rewarded and should be highly celebrated, yet it becomes a place of fear rather than a place of learning.
Absolutely, and that's also when you notice differences, cultural differences between the various tribes. Namibia itself has about 7 main tribes, in addition to a lot of smaller subgroupings and clans. But among the 7 main tribes, I also visited for briefer periods a few of the other ones. And certainly with the Ovambo tribe, which is the largest tribe in the country, you found a very different attitude to education.
Can we stop there? We have to go to a quick break. We are talking with Dr. Benedict Beckeld today. Very interesting. His memoir, Kalahari Singing. We'll be right back. This is Conscious Lifestyles. Welcome back to Conscious Lifestyles Radio Show. This is Ginger Leilani Chapin. Today we're talking with Dr. Benedict Beckeld. You are such a fascinating person. Please check out his website, Benedict Beckeld, BECKELD.com. Beautiful website. He is the author of several books, but his latest memoir is Kalahari Singing, based on his work in the Kalahari Desert as a volunteer teacher in eastern Namibia, working with the Herero tribe. So you had mentioned to me before the show that you had done a crash. You speak 7 languages, but you had done a crash course in the language of the Herero tribe. And so you were able to converse with these beautiful children that you were trying to teach English to, and certainly hope, raise their level of awareness of the world, and certainly expand their horizons by doing that. And that was the whole reason why you left your Western, very successful career in the Western world to go and do volunteer work in Namibia, which is such a fascinating thing. So many people want to do this. But you were talking before we had to go to a break about the beatings that you had witnessed of these innocent children if they didn't get an answer right on their test, or it was not becoming a place of learning, it was becoming a place of fear. And we all know the power of associations, right? If you associate learning with abuse and hurting and fearfulness, well, you're not going to want to learn, So go ahead with your story.
Yeah, and so that was exactly the case. And in the beginning, I first tried to speak with the teachers themselves, because the problem, of course, when you come as a complete stranger, I think I was probably the only white person within a 150-mile radius or so, is that whenever you try to introduce some different way of doing things, everybody's immediately going to ascribe it to the fact that you're a foreigner who doesn't understand their particular ways. And of course, that may be true in some instances. But in the beginning, when I tried to explain to the teachers, introduce to them different ways of disciplining the children, there was a complete refusal, essentially, to listen to any other possible ideas. I had hoped to be able to give maybe a workshop to the other teachers about alternative ways of punishment that did not include violence. But I never got to that point because the teachers themselves, and certainly the principal of the school himself, he was very much set in the traditional ways of doing things, and so I was never able to do that. But
is there a religious? Let me ask you, Dr. Beckeld, is there a religious component to that? Is there some sort of religion that does this?
Yeah, their religion is a combination of Christianity and older traditional tribal religion, which is much more sort of heathen, if you will. It's they believe in a god, but they also believe in their dead ancestors. And so there are certainly pagan elements to it. When the missionaries, mainly German missionaries, came there in the late 19th century, they introduced Christianity. They were mainly Northern Germans, so it was mainly Lutheranism. But they decided, if you will, or they realized that they needed to preserve some pagan elements in order for acceptance of the rest of Christianity to take root. So they're a very religious, very Christian people. They would always sing songs to God and to Jesus at the beginning of every school day. But there are also pagan elements. But the Herero themselves, they have a tradition of being rather warlike, if you will. It was always, militarily speaking, before the Europeans, were the most powerful tribe, and so they have ways that might be described perhaps as a bit more violent or a bit more abrasive than some of the other tribes. But when that is translated into an overall Namibian society that seeks to become a little more Western or economically integrated on the global scene, that's of course when such behavior is going to become unacceptable in the context of the country as a whole. But so the religious element itself, I guess, is more to be seen in combination with a larger Herero culture, rather than as a separate cause of the violence.
Well, what's really interesting is there's a correlation here of the violence that they have within their own culture to keep people in line, or to have some kind of a hierarchical, tribal situation where they're able to keep their tribe in a certain sort of warfare mentality. However, what's interesting is that you have this juxtaposition of a tribe that was very powerful in Namibia being overtaken by the Germans in the late 19th century in a warfare manner. And the Germans have been genocidal long before the Third Reich became powerful, long before Hitler. They have been genocidal in their own culture. So what's interesting is that they overtook, just to juxtapose the two, they overtook a tribe through warfare and extreme genocide, extreme violence, extreme killing, a bloodbath, if you will. Yet this tribe never saw, the ones that survived, they still have that warfare within them, within their own people. They're hurting their own children. Did you ever try to bring that to their attention as a volunteer? And did you get the other volunteers from the Western world involved in your mission to save these children so that they could have a future?
Well, I tried. And I think the point you make about the tribe themselves, their warlike history being a part of this is certainly true. Before the Germans arrived, there was plenty of warfare between the various tribes, and the Herero themselves actually did quite a lot of conquering of neighboring peoples, of other indigenous African peoples. And then, of course, once a much more powerful, militarily powerful European people arrived, even the Herero were no match. And I think that that trauma of having been the most powerful tribe and then being quite easily subdued by a European nation probably still remains on the psyche of the Herero. Even today, there are still efforts by the Herero tribe to get reparations paid by the German government over 100 years later, which has been declined. The German government issued a formal apology a few years back, but ruled out the prospects of reparations. But I think in terms of your question about getting other volunteers involved, I was the only volunteer in that particular village, but I did certainly try to get my organization involved. I wrote to the field directors and to everyone within the hierarchy of my volunteer organization to explain the problems and to see if they could offer me any solutions or any support. But that was in itself an effort with mixed success at best, because the organization was concerned about jeopardizing their relationship with the Namibian Ministry of Education overall. And if too much emphasis was put on the problems that I was having in my village, because they send volunteers to all different corners of the country. And if too much of an emphasis is put on the problems that I was having, there was always a fear on the part of my organization that we would sort of come across as overbearing Westerners who want to correct, quote unquote, everything that indigenous peoples are doing. And so I didn't receive that much help. I was essentially given a few pointers and, slides that I could use in a PowerPoint presentation about, alternative ways of punishment and so on. But essentially in terms of exerting any pressure on the school or on the local authorities to stop such punishment of the children, there was no help in that regard. So I essentially was on my own.
Well, you write about this. You write about this. The political correctness hinders success.
Yes.
So
yeah, essentially, if something is considered a cultural issue, a lot of Westerners won't touch it. Essentially, we are, teaching English is fine, but if we have to say that, for example, this particular aspect of your culture, which is that you beat your children bloody, if we say that that's wrong, that is sort of suggesting the corollary of that is to suggest that there's something wrong with their culture. And people get very queasy and squeamish about saying that there's something wrong with their culture. And that's when the exaggerated political correctness comes in. That's true in many other areas as well. For example, if we point out that the way they treat women is fairly unacceptable, that women are often, nothing more than glorified slaves, if that's pointed out, then immediately the political correctness comes in and says, oh, no, we mustn't say anything like that because that might suggest that there's something wrong with their culture.
Yeah.
And so in some of the areas where we might actually be able to help women in particular, we're not able to do so.
Well, to me, that would drive me out of my mind. Here I am trying to do the right thing. I'm doing what I find to be the right thing in this world by trying to change the world and put the world into a new and healthier direction by doing volunteer work. And I would feel stuck in the mud if I had to deal with all of this politics, which we deal with on a daily in daily Western life anyway when you are trying to create change. So you ran smack dab into that. We've got to go to a quick break. We will be right back. This is Conscious Lifestyles. Hi there. Welcome back to Conscious Lifestyles radio show. This is Ginger Leilani Chapin. I am talking with Dr. Benedict Beckeld today. Please check out his website, Benedict Beckeld, BECKELD.com, and check out his memoir, Kalahari Singing. He worked as a Kalahari Desert volunteer, as a teacher in eastern Namibia for a Western volunteer organization. You were talking about the political correctness, and have we ever seen that hinder success in the Western world, not to mention when you're trying to go to a developing country and deal with it there? So you ran smack dab into a lot of political, quote-unquote, correctness that completely stifled or somewhat stifled your efforts to stop the beating of these innocent children, because learning should be a fun thing. It should spark your imagination. It should not create violence and leave you with a bloody face or leave you with a bruised body. That's the opposite. That is the opposite of education. And here you are, so well educated, and world traveled, and you must have been so heartbroken when you came across that. Now, you also came across the misappropriation of financial donations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that was something a little more general, and that ties into a larger issue that one always has to be aware of, essentially when giving charity. That's true when you give charity to various organizations that help people here in the West, of course, also. But perhaps especially true when you give charity to faraway places. Because obviously it's much more difficult to control what actually happens with your money than if you give to some local organization. And that's, again, this is actually another area where one runs into political correctness, because if local recipients of Western donations use money in ways that is considered inappropriate or was not really the intended target, criticizing that and pointing that out is, again, something that to many people would suggest that you're saying that their culture is inferior and they won't accept any such suggestions. In particular, what was certainly the case in my village was at the school in which I taught, the school library, quote-unquote library, was pretty much empty of books. There was literally only a handful of books in the whole library. And so there was an effort, or I had started to try to organize an effort in which I collect money to purchase to purchase books for the library. But I soon realized that when you give money to the school, it is often used for the wrong thing. For example, the school would rather spend money on a large, shiny road sign, which gives the school outward prestige, rather than spend it on books for the children. Or they'll buy a very fancy mahogany desk for the principal, or a bust of the school founder or something like that, rather than books or desks for the children, which was another thing. We didn't have enough desks in the school, so a lot of the children had to learn and take notes standing up or sitting down on the floor. And so I was also considering efforts to collect money for more desks, but it's very difficult in the end to make sure that the money is used for that purpose. And again, so when one points out to people that if you give money, it's likely that they're going to use it for the wrong thing, because at least in this particular suspect community that I was in, the well-being of the children was not the first priority, then again, you will often be called racist by people who have an exaggerated sense of political correctness because they think that you're criticizing their culture. And I mean, of course, in a way, you are criticizing their culture. But
knowing me, type A personality, I would say that's not a criticism of culture. That's a criticism of greed and narcissism.
But some cultures, I suppose, all cultures have certain problems with them. There's no such thing as a perfect culture where everything runs smoothly. Mm-hmm. But whether it's an individual who is greedy, or whether there's a larger tendency of greediness in a particular community, nonetheless, we have to be allowed to say certain things, whether they are criticism of culture or not. We have to be allowed to point them out if they're true.
Agreed. Yes, agreed. And you even mentioned the narcissism of the Western volunteers themselves. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the narcissism, because being a volunteer in a developing community can be a very narcissistic sort of experience, as I know myself. It's happened to me many times since I came back from there, that when it comes up in conversation that I had worked as a volunteer in Africa, people talk to me as if I were a saint almost, which can be pleasant, but it's not really true, because volunteering in Africa, I mean, it does require some superficial sacrifice. You have to be the sort of person who can live with insects in his bed and no running water or ice cold water and all of these things. But on a little more mental level, it's actually, you're treated when you're there, you're treated as a movie star, essentially, because you're the only white person in a completely black community. And so a lot of volunteers, especially since I was a little older when I went, but a lot of volunteers are essentially people who just got out of college, or some of them maybe still in college, who are maybe a little more impressionable than at least I hope I was. Yeah. And that having that feeling of being looked up on by everyone does lead to a lot of narcissism and to a sort of mistaken belief that, well, I come here as a sort of magical light worker, and I will make all of your problems better. And usually it doesn't work out that way, of course. And it also leads to a certain blindness on the part of the volunteer regarding what kind of assistance would actually be useful and what kind of assistance would not be useful. And if you're predominantly there in order to feel better about yourself, then the kind of mistake that I just talked about, where you just give money and not realize where the money goes to, that's the kind of mistake that you're more prone to because of that narcissism.
Well, we have 1 minute left in the show. I'd love to see on your website a place for those of us who have a lot of books. I love to read. I love to learn. Where can we send used books that actual real books can get into the hands of innocent children who want to learn about architecture or natural healing or anything? Maybe that's an idea where we can send the actual, rather than sending money, you can actually send real books.
Yes, actually, that's not a bad idea. That would probably be sent to the main, there's a library in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, that deals with disseminating books to local schools out in the rural areas, and I was there as part of my own effort, and that would be probably the best place to send it.
Is there any way you can put that on your website? I'd love to see that. Everyone, we are talking with Dr. Benedict Beckeld today. You are so fascinating. I have to have you back because you've written several books. You are a very learned man, and I just thank you so much for doing volunteer work, and we do need more volunteers in this world. Thank you for listening. This has been Conscious Lifestyles.